The wedding was supposed to be a miracle, a pastor finally finding love after years of loneliness. But just 48 hours later, he was found lifeless on the floor of a honeymoon suite. His bride, weighing over 500 pounds, was the last person to see him alive. At first, police thought it was a heart attack, but the truth would shake the town to its core, because this pastor wasn't who everyone thought he was, and neither was she. Welcome to Silent Witness, True Crime Stories. Thanks to all my viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. Don't forget to subscribe, and also download your free ebook by clicking the link in the pinned comment. This is the story of a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and secrets rarely stay buried. It's a town where church attendance is high, where neighbors wave from porches, and where gossip travels faster than the Sunday sermon. But in the summer of 2019, something happened in this quiet town that would turn neighbor against neighbor, faith into suspicion, and love into a crime scene. It started with a wedding, a ceremony that many in the congregation called a miracle. Pastor John Miller, a 58-year-old widower who had spent the last 5 years burying his grief in ministry, had finally found someone. Her name was Margaret Lee, a 52-year-old woman who weighed over 500 pounds and had lived most of her life in the shadows of ridicule and isolation. Their union was unexpected, their love story unconventional, and their ending absolutely devastating. But what really happened in that honeymoon suite? Why did Pastor John die so suddenly? And why were the church funds missing the same night he was found dead? These are the questions that would haunt this town for years to come. Let's start with Pastor John Miller. To understand what happened, you have to understand who he was, or at least who people thought he was. John had been the pastor of Graceway Community Church for over 20 years. He was the kind of man who knew everyone's name, who visited the sick without being asked, who prayed over hospital beds and held the hands of the dying. When his wife Linda passed away from breast cancer in 2014, the entire town mourned with him. They watched him stand at her graveside with tears streaming down his face, watched him deliver her eulogy with a voice that cracked but never broke. And after that, they watched him disappear into his work. John threw himself into the church with a fervor that worried some of his closest friends. He preached longer sermons, held more Bible studies, volunteered at every community event. On the surface, he seemed like a man devoted to God, but those who knew him well saw the cracks. John was lonely, deeply lonely. He'd eat dinner alone at the same diner every Thursday night, always ordering the meatloaf special, always sitting in the same booth by the window. The waitress, a woman named Carla, would later tell police that John would sometimes just stare out at the parking lot for 20 minutes without touching his food, lost in some memory she couldn't see. He was drowning in silence, and no one knew how to save him. But there were other things people didn't know about Pastor John, things that wouldn't come to light until after his death. Whispers had started circulating among the church board members about financial discrepancies, about missing donation records, about checks that didn't quite add up. John had always handled the finances himself, insisting it was easier that way, that he didn't want to burden anyone else with the paperwork. Most people trusted him. After all, this was Pastor John, the man who had baptized their children, who had married their sons and daughters, who had prayed them through their darkest hours. But trust, as this town would soon learn, can be a dangerous thing, because while John was preaching about honesty and integrity every Sunday morning, he was hiding a secret that would unravel everything. But we'll get to that. First, let me tell you about Margaret. Margaret Lee was not the kind of woman you'd expect to see standing at the altar of Graceway Community Church. She was a custodian, someone who cleaned the pews after services, who emptied the trash bins and mopped the floors when everyone else had gone home. She was quiet, invisible almost, the kind of person people looked past rather than at. And Margaret knew it. She'd spent most of her life being looked past. At 500 pounds, she'd endured a lifetime of stares, whispers, and cruelty. In high school, kids had called her names she'd never forget. In her 20s, She'd tried online dating, only to be ghosted the moment she sent a full-body photo. By her 40s, she'd stopped trying altogether. She lived alone in a small trailer on the outskirts of town, surrounded by stacks of old books and boxes of things she couldn't bring herself to throw away. Her only real connection to the world was the church. Every Sunday, Margaret would sit in the back row, always in the same spot, always alone. She'd sing the hymns quietly, her voice barely audible above the others. She'd listen to Pastor John's sermons with an intensity that bordered on devotion. And when the service ended, she'd slip out before anyone could try to talk to her. But Margaret wasn't just lonely. She was desperate, desperate to be seen, to be valued, to be loved for who she was instead of judged for how she looked. For years, she prayed for one thing, just one thing, someone who would look at her and see a person worth loving. And then, in the winter of 2018, something happened that would change everything. It was during a particularly brutal snowstorm that Pastor John showed up at Margaret's trailer with 2 bags of groceries. The roads had been closed for days, and Margaret had run out of food. She didn't have family nearby, didn't have friends she could call. She'd been rationing crackers and canned soup, trying to make it last. When she opened the door and saw John standing there, snow dusting his shoulders and a kind smile on his face, she almost cried. He didn't make a big deal out of it, didn't act like he was doing her some grand favor. He just handed her the bags, asked if she needed anything else, and told her to call the church if she did. That one act of kindness cracked something open inside Margaret, something she'd kept locked away for years. They started talking after that, first just polite conversations after church services, then longer phone calls in the evenings. John would call her late at night, when the loneliness felt too heavy to bear, and they'd talk about scripture, about life, about loss. Margaret listened in a way no one else did. She didn't try to fix him, didn't offer empty platitudes. She just listened. And for John, that was everything. Their relationship grew slowly, carefully, like 2 people afraid to hope too much. But by the spring of 2019, something had shifted. John started visiting Margaret's trailer more often, bringing her flowers, cooking her dinner, reading to her from the Psalms. He told her things he'd never told anyone, about how he felt like a fraud sometimes, about how he missed his wife so much it physically hurt, about how he didn't know if he was strong enough to keep going. And Margaret, in turn, let him see her, really see her, in a way she'd never let anyone before. She told him about the years of rejection, about the loneliness that felt like drowning, about how she'd convinced herself she wasn't worthy of love. And John, looking at her with tears in his eyes, said something she'd never forget. He said, "You are worthy, Margaret. You are so worthy." 3 months later, he proposed. The congregation was stunned. Some people were genuinely happy, moved by the idea that their pastor had found love again. Others were less kind. There were whispers, cruel jokes about how he must be desperate, about how she must have tricked him somehow. But John didn't care. On June 15, 2019, Pastor John Miller and Margaret Lee stood before 30 guests in Graceway Community Church and exchanged vows. Margaret struggled to walk down the aisle, her breath labored, her face flushed with emotion. But when she reached John, and he took her hands in his and smiled at her like she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, everyone in that room felt something. John's vow was simple, but powerful. He said, "Love is patient, love is kind, and today love looks just like this." People cried, people clapped, and for a moment it really did feel like a miracle. But miracles, as this town would soon learn, don't always last. After the wedding, John and Margaret drove to a small countryside inn just outside Columbus, about an hour and a half from their town. It was a modest place, nothing fancy, but it had charm, old wooden beams, lace curtains, a view of rolling farmland. The innkeeper, an older woman named Diane, would later tell police that the couple seemed happy when they checked in. John carried Margaret's bag, helped her up the stairs, and kept his hand on the small of her back the entire time. They disappeared into their room, and for the next 48 hours, no one heard from them. Back home, the congregation assumed they were enjoying their honeymoon, disconnected from the world, wrapped up in each other. But on the morning of June 18th, everything changed. Diane went to check on the couple around 11 a.m. because checkout time had passed and no one had answered the phone. She knocked on the door, called out their names, and when no one responded, she used her master key. What she found would haunt her for the rest of her life. Pastor John Miller was lying face down on the floor between the bed and the bathroom door. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were half open, staring at nothing. Margaret was sitting on the edge of the bed, rocking back and forth, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. She kept saying the same thing over and over. "He just stopped breathing. He just stopped breathing." Diane screamed and called 911. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but it was too late. John was dead. At first, it seemed straightforward, a tragic but natural death. The paramedics noted that John had been overweight, that he was in his late 50s, that he'd likely had underlying health issues. A heart attack seemed like the most logical explanation. But then one of the paramedics noticed something odd. There was bruising on John's neck, faint but visible, like someone had pressed their thumbs into his throat. And on the nightstand, there was a white residue, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. They bagged it as evidence. Margaret was still hysterical when the police arrived. She told them that John had complained of feeling dizzy the night before, that he'd drunk some wine and gone to bed early. She said she woke up in the middle of the night and found him on the floor, unresponsive. She tried to help him, she said, tried to give him CPR, but she couldn't move him, couldn't reach him properly because of her size. The officers took notes, asked her a few more questions, and told her not to leave town. But as they were walking out, one of the detectives noticed something else. John's phone was missing, so was his wedding ring. When they asked Margaret about it, she said she didn't know where they were, that maybe he'd left them somewhere. But her voice wavered when she said it, and the detective made a note. By the time police left the inn, the case had already shifted from a tragic accident to something far more complicated. The autopsy took 3 days. In that time, the town was consumed by speculation. People gathered in coffee shops and church parking lots, dissecting every detail they knew, every rumor they'd heard. Some people defended Margaret, insisting she was incapable of hurting anyone. Others weren't so sure. The gossip was relentless, and Margaret, still staying at a motel nearby, became a prisoner in her own grief. She stopped answering the phone, stopped eating, stopped leaving her room. When the autopsy results finally came back, they didn't bring clarity, they brought more questions. The medical examiner found no evidence of a heart attack. John's heart had been in relatively good condition for a man his age. There was no blockage, no rupture, no clear cause of death. But there was something else. John's blood showed abnormally high levels of insulin, levels that didn't make sense for someone who wasn't diabetic. The white residue on the nightstand, crushed insulin tablets, the bruising on his neck, consistent with pressure, though not necessarily strangulation. The medical examiner couldn't definitively rule it a homicide, but he couldn't call it natural causes either. The official cause of death was listed as undetermined, pending further investigation. And just like that, Margaret Lee went from grieving widow to prime suspect. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. Detectives started digging into Margaret's background, and what they found was deeply unsettling. Margaret had been married before, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And all 3 of her previous husbands had died under questionable circumstances. Her first husband, a man named Robert, had died of a suspected insulin overdose in 1998. At the time, it was ruled accidental. Robert had been diabetic, and the assumption was that he'd miscalculated his dose. Margaret had collected a $50,000 life insurance payout. Her second husband, David, had died in 2005 after what was described as a sudden and unexplained seizure. Again, Margaret was the beneficiary of his life insurance policy, this time $75,000. Her third husband, Kenneth, had died in 2012. The official cause was heart failure, but there had been whispers that were never loud enough to turn into an investigation. Margaret had changed her last name each time, moving from town to town, starting over. No one in Ohio knew about her past. No one had thought to ask. When detectives confronted Margaret with this information, she broke down. She admitted that yes, she'd been married before, that yes, her husbands had all died, but she insisted it wasn't her fault. She said she was cursed, that everyone she loved eventually left her, that God was punishing her for something she didn't understand. But the detectives weren't buying it. They obtained a warrant to search her trailer, and what they found was damning. On her laptop, they discovered a search history that made their blood run cold. How much insulin to cause death? Symptoms of insulin overdose. How long before overdose shows symptoms? Can insulin poisoning be detected in autopsy? The searches dated back months, long before she'd even married John. There were also emails to insurance companies, inquiries about policy payouts, beneficiary changes. And then there was the final piece of evidence, John's phone, hidden in a shoebox under Margaret's bed, along with his wedding ring and $8,000 in cash. When confronted with the evidence, Margaret didn't deny it. She just sat there, tears streaming down her face, and whispered, "I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to need me." Margaret's confession was chilling, not because it was cold or calculated, but because it was so painfully human. She told detectives that she'd fallen in love with John, that for the first time in her life, someone had made her feel like she mattered. But as their wedding day approached, she became terrified. Terrified that once they were married, once the novelty wore off, he'd see her the way everyone else did. Fat, ugly, unworthy. She convinced herself that the only way to keep him was to make him dependent on her, to make him sick enough that he'd need her to take care of him. She'd researched insulin because she knew it could cause confusion, dizziness, weakness, symptoms that would make him seem fragile, vulnerable. She thought if she gave him just a little, just enough to make him feel unwell, he'd lean on her, need her, never leave her. But on their wedding night, she gave him too much. She crushed the tablets into his wine, watched him drink it, watched him laugh, and tell her how happy he was. And then, hours later, she watched him collapse. She tried to help him, tried to call for help, but she panicked. She didn't want anyone to know what she'd done. So she waited. She waited until morning, until it was too late, and then she called the front desk. Her confession was a mix of remorse and delusion. She kept saying, "I loved him. I just loved him so much." But the story didn't end there. Because as detectives continued their investigation, they uncovered something even more shocking. Pastor John Miller had secrets of his own. The church accountant, a woman named Evelyn, came forward with information that turned the entire case on its head. She told police that she'd been quietly investigating financial discrepancies in the church's records for months. Donations were missing, checks were being written to accounts that didn't exist, and when she tried to bring it up to John, he'd brushed her off, told her she was mistaken, told her to let him handle it. But Evelyn didn't let it go. She dug deeper, and what she found was staggering. Over the course of 2 years, John had embezzled nearly $80,000 from Graceway Community Church. He'd been siphoning money from the donation fund, creating fake invoices, writing checks to a private account, an account that was under Margaret's name. At first, detectives thought Margaret was in on it, that she and John had been working together. But Margaret swore she had no idea. She said John had asked her to open a joint account a few months before the wedding, told her it was for their future, for emergencies. She'd signed the papers without reading them, trusting him completely. Detectives believed her. The timeline didn't add up for her to be complicit in the embezzlement. But it raised a horrifying new possibility. What if John had been planning to fake his own death? What if he'd intended to disappear, to take the money and start over somewhere new with Margaret, but she'd ruined the plan by actually killing him? The theory was supported by evidence found on John's phone, text messages to an unknown number, discussions about new identities, about leaving the country, about starting fresh. John had been planning an escape, and Margaret, unknowingly, had been his cover. But when she gave him the insulin, when she tried to make him dependent on her, she'd accidentally ended his life and destroyed the plan. It was a tragedy layered upon a tragedy, a love story twisted by desperation, greed, and fear. The trial that followed was a media sensation. The prosecution painted Margaret as a calculating black widow, a woman who had killed multiple husbands for insurance money. The defense argued that she was a victim herself, a woman so broken by loneliness and rejection that she'd made a terrible, tragic mistake. The jury deliberated for 4 days. In the end, they found Margaret Lee guilty of voluntary manslaughter, not murder. The judge sentenced her to 18 years in prison. As she was led out of the courtroom, Margaret looked back at the gallery, at the people from Graceway Community Church who had come to watch, and she said something that would echo in that town for years. She said, "I just wanted to be loved." Graceway Community Church never recovered. The scandal tore the congregation apart. Some members left, unable to reconcile the man they'd trusted with the criminal he'd become. Others stayed, trying to rebuild, but the damage was done. The church eventually closed its doors in 2021. The building sold to a developer who turned it into office space. The stained glass windows that had once glowed with light during Sunday services were removed and auctioned off. The town itself was forever changed. People stopped trusting so easily, stopped believing in the surface goodness of others. They'd learned a hard lesson, that sometimes the people who seem the most faithful, the most devoted, are hiding the darkest secrets. And sometimes, the people we pity, the people we overlook, are capable of things we can't imagine. This story isn't just about murder. It's about loneliness, about the lengths people will go to feel seen, to feel needed, to feel loved. It's about faith, and how easily it can be weaponized, how trust can become a tool for manipulation. It's about two broken people who found each other in the darkness, and instead of saving each other, they destroyed each other. Margaret Lee is currently serving her sentence at the Ohio Reformatory for Women. She's lost over 200 pounds, participates in prison ministry, and writes letters to anyone who will read them, still searching for connection, still searching for someone to see her as more than the monster she became. Pastor John Miller is buried in a small cemetery on the edge of town, far from the church he once led. His grave is unmarked, no headstone, no flowers. The congregation couldn't agree on what to write, couldn't find words that honored the man they thought they knew without acknowledging the man he actually was. So they left it blank, and that perhaps is the saddest part of all. So let me ask you this. Do you think Margaret planned it all along, or was this truly a tragic accident born out of desperation? Do you think John was a victim, or did his own greed and deception make him complicit in his own death? Would you have seen the red flags, or would you have believed in love too? Tell us what you think in the comments. And if you found this story as haunting as we did, wait until you hear what happened when a Florida man married his online girlfriend, only to find out she wasn't real. Subscribe so you never miss the next shocking true crime story. Because the truth, as you've just seen, is always stranger and darker than fiction.